SASE is the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers, and what do we do at SASE Pro, the professional focus side, is we focus on this problem. Data shows that Asians are 50% less likely to get promoted than our white counterparts versus our white peers. This creates an Asian leadership gap that many of us see and feel every single day within our careers, where we feel like we're not getting promoted and we're wondering what the problem is. So what we have found from research, from interviewing now close to 150 executives, is that there are 4 common factors. These 4: lack of political and organizational savvy, cultural deference to authority, ineffective communication and influencing skills, and an aversion to risk-taking. Now, I've got an entire other presentation to actually go through each of those bullet point by bullet point. We won't do that today, though. The challenge is that a lot of times we don't even know this. Our own community doesn't even recognize that this challenge exists. The model minority myth exists, is pervasive, and so awareness that these numbers are even in play can be a challenge. Then beyond that is what to do about it. And then lastly is getting the resources together to be able to do something about it. And so with that, we've created a suite of programs at SASE Pro to help Asian ERGs and companies and Asian professionals like you to have access to more programs tackling directly these challenges. And amongst those are this ongoing free series, the webinar series that you are part of. Happens every month. We bring a variety of different speakers to talk about relevant topics. It is recording, will be on our website. You can view prior ones. And you just stay in touch and see when the next ones are coming up. So with that, our speaker today will have a brief presentation, and then there'll be a moderated Q&A with our presenter. And throughout this process, please do enter your questions into the chat. I will be moderating the Q&A, asking our guest questions as we go, or at the end, most likely. And so this month, for this one, we have a wonderful guest, Kyla Zhao, who daytime she works for Silicon Valley, in the Silicon Valley as an analyst. At night, she writes novels starring women and girls of color in the workplace. She graduated from Stanford University in 2021 with an MA in communications and a BA in psychology. Before tech, she worked in fashion, so hence this title making a lot more sense to you. So we've invited Kyla just to tell a little bit about her story, how she ended up becoming a writer. She's going to share lots of insights in that frame. And, this is interesting to get a different perspective. I know generation-wise, Kyla and I are different generations. And so I'm fascinated by talking with her in the past, and I figured that you guys might be fascinated by hearing a different perspective as well. So with that, let me stop talking, and Kyla, welcome to the stage, and please feel free to take it over.
Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and also for inviting me to be on this webinar. It's very nice to be here. It's very nice to meet all of you. And I am excited to share more about my journey with all of you and how I combined 2 very different aspects of my life. And so I am going to be sharing my screen. And today I'll be sharing the tale of how I came to be a writer and how that was inspired by a pretty dramatic career pivot in my life. So Parag has kind of given you a walkthrough of my background, but I will just go through it again really quickly. So I was born and grew up in Singapore. And after high school, I moved to California to attend Stanford University, graduated 3 years ago with degrees in communications and psychology. And after that, I worked as a fashion journalist for publications like Vogue, Tatler, Harper's Bazaar. Fashion has been my first love, and it's still a field I feel really passionate about. These days, life is looking a little bit different. So I work as a data analyst at a B2B tech company in Silicon Valley. And on the side, I write novels starring women of color in the workplace. I have 4 books, 3 books that are published, and 1 that is going to be published in 2026. And the one that I'll be telling you a little bit more about is my second book. And this is just a quick overview of some of the media and TV programs I've been invited to be a part of, where I can share more about my books. So here's a story of how I started writing. And this goes all the way back to spring 2020 when I was a junior at Stanford University. That's a photo of me with my college friends, and it was just a very typical college lifestyle. But as I'm sure most of us remember, spring 2020 was also when the world underwent a drastic, very dramatic transformation as COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world. And suddenly, school was shutting down. All of us had to leave campus and go back home to be with our families. And I wanted to do the same. I wanted to go back to Singapore and to be with my family in this very tumultuous time. But that was also when every country was shutting down its borders. And so there was a very real fear that if I were to leave the United States, I wouldn't be able to come back to, continue attending school, to look for internships, look for jobs. There was still a time when a lot of us naively thought that, the pandemic wouldn't really last that long, that it wouldn't even really be a pandemic, and that at most we will only be gone from campus for like a few weeks. So I didn't want to leave for a few weeks and then not be able to come back. And so I decided to stay put in California. And ultimately, I ended up spending most of 2020 living alone by myself in California, very far away from my family who is still in Singapore. And as a result, I got very homesick and very lonely. And that summer was also when I witnessed anti-Asian racism sweeping throughout the country. As we were all in lockdown, my main sources of contact with the outside world was through social media and the media. But every time I turned on a TV, I would see, reports of politicians in power saying very disparaging comments about the Asian community. And then I would go on social media like Twitter, and I would see a tweet about how elderly Asians are being the victims of hate crime. And when I saw photos of their blackened eyes and bruised faces, it was really hard for me to not see my own parents and my grandparents in their places. And so, all in all, it was a very emotionally tumultuous time for me. I was struggling with, loneliness, homesickness, and what in hindsight I realized to be the onset of depression. And the worst thing was because I was living alone, I didn't really have anyone to confide in. I think I easily went weeks without seeing another person. At some point, I started talking to myself just so that I could still hear my own voice. So it was in that kind of setting where I felt like there was so many thoughts and emotions brewing up within me. And if I didn't find an outlet for them, like I literally felt like I was a volcano about to explode. And so, in the absence of any human company, I channeled those emotions into words. And I started writing a story set in my home country. It was, I think, my way of staying connected to home at a time when I didn't know when I would get to be back again. And this is just a very quick summary of my writing and my publishing process. So that summer, I started drafting the story. And it was only many months later that I started thinking about getting it published. Before that, becoming an author wasn't remotely on my radar. I didn't even think it was possible for a non-American to be published in America. But as I was writing, I made some online writing friends, and they were a lot more familiar with the publishing process than I was. And so I learned from them, how to navigate the process. And then many months later, in April 2021, I got a literary agent. And then in May, I sold my book at auction, which meant that a few different publishers were interested in buying my book. And so we went to auction, and I sold my book to Penguin Random House. And I remember this was the day before my birthday and also around the time when I was graduating. So it felt like a nice end of one chapter of my life and the start of a new chapter of my life. And then fast forward to 2023, and my first book comes out worldwide. And yeah, that was kind of the start of my publishing journey. And so this was the first book that I wrote, the one that is set in Singapore. It's called The Fraud Squad, and it came out last January. And my second adult novel, which is the one I'll be talking a little bit more about today, it came out earlier this year, and it is set in the tech industry of Silicon Valley and inspired by a very personal experience. And exactly 1 week later, I have a new book coming out. So this is a novel that is more suited for perhaps a younger audience, like teenagers and preteens. And then I very recently got my 4th book deal for a young adult novel that will be coming out 2 years later. And so these 4 books are across different genres and even different age groups. And in general, I think I just like exploring and experimenting with different formats and different facets of my writing. And so Valley Verified, the book that came out earlier this year, is one that is very close to my heart. Here are just some reviews about it from places like the American Library Association and Kirkus Reviews, which is a well-known book review site. And one key focus of my book is its necessary discussion on sexism and gender bias in the tech industry and how I am juxtaposing two seemingly very different worlds of technology and fashion. But as you read the book, you'll discover that they share a lot more similarities than one might imagine. And that was also a learning process for me as well. And here is how I came up with the idea for Valley Verified. So as I mentioned earlier, after graduating from university, I started working in fashion. Even before that, I've done various internships in the fashion industry. And so I was a fashion journalist. Here's just a screenshot of some of the magazines and publications that I contributed to. But after a few months of working, a new opportunity came up from a tech company in Silicon Valley. And at that time, even though I was working in fashion, I was actually very interested in technology. I was writing a lot of articles about the intersection of fashion and technology, how all the major design houses were utilizing, virtual reality, augmented reality, and even NFTs and blockchain and cryptocurrency. So, and I did go to school at Stanford, in the heart of Silicon Valley. So I've always been somewhat around the tech ecosystem. And when this opportunity came up, I thought that it was a very interesting challenge. And so I decided to accept it. And so I made a very big pivot from the industry of high fashion to high tech. And not only did I make an industry pivot, I also ended up leaving my home country of Singapore. So after I graduated, I was working in Singapore. But I packed my bags and bought a one-way ticket back to California to Silicon Valley. And that was in August 2021. So just a few months into my fashion job. And then I arrived in California and I was getting ready to start. And so for context, I was hired by a tech company, but I was hired for a non-technical role. My educational background was non-technical. I studied, the humanities and the social sciences in communications and psychology. I had no work experience in anything technical. But then 2 weeks before I started, and I was already in California at this time, the company went through a massive reorganization. And so the team that I was hired to join got swallowed into a new team, a team that is very, very technical. And that's when I realized that my job scope was looking very different. Suddenly, I had to learn to code. And okay, let me backtrack a little bit to my childhood. So I think, I grew up with what I realized in hindsight to be a very fixed mindset. And for those who don't know, fixed mindset is kind of a mindset where you think that whatever you achieve is because of your innate abilities and not something that can be developed with time. And in hindsight, I think that was a result of my upbringing. So growing up, what I heard a lot of was, you're so naturally good at writing. And what my brain chose to fixate on was the word naturally. And so I just always kind of internalized the notion that there were things that I was naturally better at, such as, English, writing, the creative work. And then in high school, I failed my very first exam, and it was a math exam. And I remember I was talking about it with my parents, and my dad just said something that, really stuck with me. He said, maybe you're just not a math person. And I really, really bought into that. I was like I just kind of convinced myself like, yeah, like I am more of a language and writing person. I am not a math and not a technical person. And so, when this whole thing happened, when I was suddenly faced with the realization that I needed to learn how to code, my instant thought was, oh, that's just not something I'm capable of doing. Like, that's just not the kind of brain that I have. Like, I'm not able to code. And so as I started this new job, I was just overwhelmed with so many self-doubt, so much imposter syndrome, and honestly, so much regret that I decided to go down this path. I was good at my fashion job. I love my fashion job. I love the people I worked with. And, I spent so many nights just lying awake in bed and wondering, why did I choose to step out of my comfort zone and take on a new challenge? Like, I'm setting myself up for failure. I am bringing myself into something that I'm just not going to be good at and that everyone else is so much better at. And these were a lot of the thoughts that were running through my head that, everyone's going to realize what I've already realized, which is that I'm not qualified. I don't deserve to be there. And the worst thing was I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about all these feelings. My parents were really worried about me because I'm so far away from home and I didn't want them to worry even more. So every time I called back home, I would only tell them the good things. Like, oh yeah, there's free lunch in the office, or the Californian weather is so amazing. And I also couldn't bring myself to tell my friends because all my friends seemed so accomplished. It seemed like everyone knew what they were doing and what they wanted to get out of their career, everyone except for me. And I also felt like there was this image of a successful Stanford graduate that I had to live up to. And so I just couldn't bring myself to tell anyone that I feel like I failed and that I'm still failing in a lot of ways. And then in December 2021, so this was about 4 months into my new job in tech, I was going back home to Singapore to spend the holidays with my family. And it was a 17-hour flight, and there were no good movies. And so I had a lot of time on the flight to be thinking and to be regretting. And I just remember, thinking to myself, like, what am I going to say when my parents ask me how my new job is going? Like, I could, hide the truth from them when it's over the phone. But I know that if I were to look at my mom in the face, like I wouldn't be able to hide it from her. And so again, like during the pandemic, there was so much just like turmoil in my head. And I felt like I had to get it out of me. I had to find a way to compartmentalize and to sort through everything. So I decided to turn them into words. So on the plane itself, I took out my laptop and I just started writing the very first chapter of Valley Verified. And a lot of it I drew from my own experience of moving from high fashion to high tech, from my personal feelings and struggles. But I also did a lot of research in a way into the tech ecosystem. I read a lot of nonfiction books written by women who were part of the ecosystem, and I would highly recommend these books to you all. And I also spoke to other women who have worked in tech, women who are a lot further in their careers, who have been around Silicon Valley for a lot longer than I have. So I spoke to them to try to get their perspective as well. And I finished the first draft, and fast forward 2 years later, and my book came out worldwide this January. And here's a brief description of Valley Verified. It's set in the tech industry of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's about a fashion journalist who's forced to quit her New York job and move to Silicon Valley to take on a new role at a tech startup. She's responsible for securing an 8-figure investment that could make or break the startup and her own future. And in this cutthroat land of tech bros and tech billionaires, she has to tackle the people who doubt her, but she must also confront her own insecurities and prove that there's more to her than what meets the eye. And one very gratifying thing about this book after it came out is that readers, both women and men from all ages and all career backgrounds, reached out to me to say how much the story resonated with them, to say how much they could relate to what my main character was going through. And one thing that I did not expect was that people who are a lot further along in their career than I was, who I thought, would be beyond these things like imposter syndrome. They actually told me that they could really relate to my main character. And so it turns out that imposter syndrome isn't something that leaves you, as you become more established, as you get increasingly fancier sounding job titles. It is a very universal challenge that kind of accompanies us throughout our lifetime. And the only change is that perhaps people learn to deal with the imposter syndrome and the insecurities better. But I think now I've realized that it's never possible to truly get rid of them. And you know, one question that I get asked a lot is like, how do you balance your tech career with your author career? And I believe that the two of them are very nice counterpoints that help me appreciate each other. So here's how working in tech helps me appreciate being an author. So firstly, when it comes to writing, there is a lot more freedom and flexibility because I am crafting my own story. It is drawn from my own mind. And I don't really have to, pay attention to what the stakeholders want because I am the stakeholder in a way. There's also something very gratifying about creating something that is entirely of your own. You don't really have to think about, what are the requirements that I must adhere to, what is the process I must go through for getting approval and for moving to the next stage. Everything just comes from my own mind. And also, there are no office politics to deal with, which is always pleasant. And lastly, I think the impact of my writing is a lot clearer. So sometimes, when working in tech, like you spend all your time coding, and what happens is that maybe the shade of red on a button changes slightly. But with writing, when readers reach out to you and they tell me how much they enjoyed my book or how much they could relate to it, like um, that just shows me the impact of my writing. And so it's always very nice to hear from readers and to realize that there are people out there reading my books and that I'm not just writing into a void. But conversely, writing also helps me appreciate tech because there are a lot of frustrating things about being an author as well. So the thing about writing is, as you might have noticed, publishing works in multi-year cycles. So for instance, I just sold my fourth book, Heirs of Infamy. I sold it in May. That's when I got the book deal. But it's only going to come out more than 2 years later in 2026. And that's a very regular cycle for publishing. We work 2 years in advance. And so the thing is, you can write a book and you are just not going to know how it's going to be received until 2 years later. But with tech, for instance, if I'm coding, I can immediately know whether my code is working or not. So having fast and regular feedback is honestly so helpful and helps me improve a lot faster. Secondly, there is a clearer boundary between work and my personal self. And I'm not just talking about work-life balance. So I think when you're writing, sometimes readers can conflate the content you put out with yourself as the content creator. And so it is natural and I think also very tempting to make certain assumptions about the author based on their books. And so in a way that is a little bit scary to know that when I'm putting a book out there, I'm also in a way exposing myself to scrutiny and judgment. But in my full-time job in tech, I don't really have that problem. No one's going to be making judgments about my moral character based on the code that I'm producing. And as I was saying earlier, the thing about writing is that I don't have to deal with office politics, but I also really enjoy the collaborative nature of my job. So writing, as with most creative work, it is a very solitary activity. It takes an entire village to put a book out there into the world. There's so many people working on it, like the art designers, the graphic designers, and so on and so forth. But the writing of the book itself, the creation of the story, that is a very lonely process in a way. And no matter how supportive your friends and your family are, if you have a writer's block, it's really just between you and your computer screen. There's no one who can help you get through that period. Whereas in my tech job, I really like the fact that I have a team to turn to when I'm struggling with something. I can ask them for help, I can ask them for suggestions, for advice. And lastly, there is a clearer measure of success in my tech job, I believe. So in writing, because writing is such a subjective thing, it's really hard to determine whether I have succeeded in a book or not. And it really feels like the definitions of success are just constantly fluctuating. One day I could be feeling really happy about my writing. I'm like, yeah, I just wrote the best thing ever. And then literally an hour later, I could be like, oh wow, this is crap. Like no one should ever read my book. And so it's such an up and down emotional journey sometimes. But in my tech job, if my code succeeds, if my stakeholder approves of the final product, of the final deliverable, then it means that I've succeeded and I can move on to the next thing. But ultimately, I like how the two balance each other out. I like how this combination of tech and writing allows me to use both my left and my right brain. And I enjoy seeing how, each plays off the other and how I could bring the skills that I pick up from one job and apply it to my other job. And I've also come to realize that having a different perspective doesn't mean that it has to be a worse perspective. And I will say, when I was given a chance to speak at this webinar, and I've looked up the previous webinar speakers, and I was just so impressed by their content. And honestly, I was wondering if I was qualified to be presenting this because my background is rather different from previous speakers. But like I said, I think maybe a different perspective doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing. So when I first started my tech job, I was very worried that my lack of a technical background in my education and in my previous work experience would count against me. That it would mean that I couldn't keep up with the rest of my team, that I couldn't bring anything valuable to the table. But as time went on, I realized that my perspective is actually very helpful in bridging a very technical input and conveying it to a very non-technical audience. And my realization actually came from working in fashion. So, working in fashion, one thing that always fascinated me was advertising for fragrances. Because these advertising, you are never like when you look at this graphic, for instance, or when you look at a video for a perfume, you are not going to be able to experience the final product for yourself. So, any attraction that you develop towards the product, it really comes from the story that the advertisement tries to portray and how they try to evoke certain feelings within you. And that is really the same for my work as well. Ultimately, when I'm conveying a technical product to a non-technical executive audience, I'm not trying to explain to them the intricacies of the code itself. I'm trying to tell them the big picture. I'm trying to evoke a certain feeling within them. I'm trying to get them to feel confident about the product. And a lot of that is basically storytelling. And I remember in one of my conversations with my manager, and we were putting together this presentation deck for an executive presentation. And my manager was saying, oh, we should open our presentation with a hook. And it was like a light bulb went off in my mind. I was like literally, this is like writing a book. Like you want to start off with an attractive hook. You want to make sure that there is a good structure and flow to your presentation that will be easy for the executives to follow when they don't have all the background and technical knowledge. And you want to leave off with a key takeaway message. And I will also just move into five main takeaways that I've gotten from, my rather multifaceted career journey so far that brings me from fashion to tech to writing. So number one would be to be open to surprises. Back in 2020, I never saw myself becoming an author. I didn't think I was creative enough to come up with any original book ideas of my own. I didn't think I would have the stamina to write an entire book, which just seemed like such an overwhelmingly big number to me at that time. But in hindsight, I'm very grateful to myself that I let myself explore this path of being a writer, even though it wasn't something I had envisioned for myself. And similarly, I wish that, when I moved to the tech industry, that I had let myself be more open to this new path instead of always comparing it to my previous job in fashion and how it was just not going to measure up. I think that mindset really did not help me. yeah, so if not for the fact that I was open to surprises, I wouldn't have 2 books out and a third book coming out next week. Second takeaway is to just ask myself, what would I do if I know I couldn't fail? So I briefly outlined my publishing process earlier. And in hindsight, I'm actually very grateful that I didn't know too much about the publishing industry when I first started, because if I did, I think I would have been too intimidated to even try. These are some statistics I only found out, way after I got a book deal. So, for instance, according to online numbers, only 1 to 2% of writers end up getting a book agent. And then of the writers who have an agent, only 1% end up getting a book deal. And so if I had known these numbers, I would have been like, Kyla, there's no way you're going to be part of that 1%. So like, don't even bother. You're just going to fail and then you'll be wasting your time. So yeah. And so similarly, I wish I had told myself that when I was starting my new tech job. I was so convinced that I didn't have what it takes to succeed. And that mindset really just counted against me. When you walk in believing that you're gonna fail, like you're going to fail. And if you don't believe in yourself, I think that lack of confidence can be felt by other people as well. And so no one's gonna have confidence in you if you don't have confidence in yourself. My third takeaway is that a rising tide lifts all boats. So growing up, I think girls especially, we have been taught to see one another as competition. In Hollywood movies, only one girl can be the homecoming queen, only one girl can win the affections of the cute boy. And I see this in publishing as well. Um, it has never happened to me, but I've heard from my writing friends that, if you are an author of color, if you come from an underrepresented community, one piece of feedback that you might hear quite commonly from publishers is, oh, we really enjoy your book, but we have already bought a book from an Asian author. And so it feels like a zero-sum game where there's really only space for a few people from your community to succeed. And then so we start seeing one another as competition. And I think the same can be applied to the tech industry as well. Because there are so few visible female executives out there in the tech industry, it sometimes inadvertently creates the impression that there's only room at the top for a few women to succeed. And so when we start seeing other women as competition for success, we are letting the real people in power, the men, get away with too much. And the fourth thing, which honestly I think is the biggest lesson I've learned so far, I don't even know why this is number 4, it should be number 1 really, is that comparison's the thief of joy. In publishing, you can be playing the comparison game all day long at any stage of the process. When you don't have an agent, it could be, why does my friend have an agent? Why did they get a book deal? Why did they get more money for their book deal? Why did their book get turned into a movie? Why is their book getting better reviews? You could be asking these questions all day long and you would just be torturing yourself. And when I started at my tech job, I was playing the same comparison game. I was looking at all my coworkers around me, and I was like, yeah, everyone has a STEM degree from a top school. I don't. Everyone has so much experience in coding. I don't. Everyone seems to know what they're doing. Everyone seems to be so much better at it. Everyone seems to be getting promoted so quickly. I'm the worst one. Wow, this really sucks. But ultimately, all those things are out of my control. I cannot control the fact that I started learning coding later than my coworkers did. I cannot control the fact that I didn't have a STEM degree. So, like, sure, I didn't have those things, but thinking about them wouldn't really serve me. It wouldn't really help me improve. It wouldn't really move me along the process. So now, instead of comparing myself to others, I try to compare myself to who I was yesterday. And so I just ask myself, am I even like 0.001% better than I was yesterday? And if I am, I feel like at least I'm on the right track. And lastly, progress comes in all forms. So I see that very clearly with writing. This is a screenshot of my word count tracker when I was writing my 4th book. And so this was from June this year. And so the last column shows the number of words I wrote every day. And it's going pretty well for the first 4 days. And then on the 16th of June, I ended up reading what I had written so far, and I realized that one chapter just was not working well at all. And so it was very painful, but I ended up just deleting the entire chapter and rewriting it from scratch. And it hurts to see that negative number, but I think overall, I know that deleting that chapter is actually going to make my book itself stronger, like as a whole. So, that is progress. Yeah. Sometimes progress is depicted as a linear line, which I think we all know is not true. It is more likely that progress looks very topsy-turvy with some twists and turns. But I would argue that, progress sometimes means you have to step one step back in order to move forward. And that could be painful, knowing that you have to establish a certain distance, that you sometimes have to backtrack, but it means that you're just moving closer to your overall goal. And building off of that, I think it is so important to celebrate progress. I have a pretty type A personality. I'm always looking forward to the next goal. So when I hit my target, I celebrate for like a day. And then immediately afterwards, I'm looking forward to the next thing. Like, oh, what's the next thing I could be striving to achieve? What's the next thing that will make me happy if I achieve it? And that is just such a tiring mindset sometimes, because I feel like a hamster that's just always running on the wheel, and then I can never step off, and I'm just always looking ahead to the next thing. And I just have to learn to, kind of separate my sense of self-worth from my achievements, and realize that I shouldn't get my validation from achieving any goals or from setting goals. So it's still very much a work in progress. I'm still learning how to go about doing this. Yeah, so just as a summary, my six takeaways from my journey so far are that I should be open to surprises. I should try everything, assuming that I would not fail. A rising tide lifts all boats. So, I've benefited so much from the guidance of my mentors in both writing and in tech, and I really hope to pay it forward. Comparison's a thief of joy. Progress comes in all forms, and I should celebrate the progress I've made. And I can just talk a little bit briefly about my other two novels. So this is the one that's coming out in a week. It's like a family-friendly version of The Queen's Gambit, so it's suitable for parents and kids alike. It stars a chess player who makes a high-stakes bet with a rival that girls can be as good as boys at the game. But with high stakes come higher pressure. And as she sets out to win their bet, she finds herself facing a new problem of performance anxiety. And as it threatens not just her performance on the board, but also her love for the game, she has to ask herself, can you still play for fun if you're playing to win? And this kind of ties back to what I was saying earlier about distancing a sense of self-worth from your achievements. And then this is my very first book, The Fraud Squad. It's set in Singapore high society, and it's about an ordinary working class woman who pretends to be a socialite to get her dream job. And with the help of her friends, she infiltrates high society and gets swept into this glamorous new world. But she begins to learn not all that glitters is gold. Everyone in this seemingly perfect world is hiding a secret, and someone is out to expose her secret. So on the surface, it looks like my books are all about very different topics. And I can also reveal to you that my fourth book coming out in 2026, it is historical fiction. It's set in San Francisco, Chinatown in the 1940s, and it's about two rival gangs. So yeah, on the surface, it seems like my books are all very different. I mean, one's about high society, one's about Silicon Valley, one's about competitive chess, one is about Chinatown gangs. And so it seems like there's nothing really connecting them together. But I would say that there are two common themes across all my books. So number one is I enjoy exploring what it means to feel a sense of belonging, or rather what it means to not feel a sense of belonging. And number two, I like exploring the idea of imposter syndrome. In my first book, it's a very tangible manifestation because my main character is actually an imposter. But for my other book, it's really about the characters grappling with feeling like they don't deserve to be there, that they are not qualified, and so they feel like imposters. And so in a way, my books are just a way for me to unpack my own complicated feelings about this. And yeah, that concludes the end of this presentation segment of the webinar. Please feel free to stay in touch and reach out. I have a website, I'm on Instagram, I have a newsletter on Substack, and I can also be reached by email.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyla, for sharing your story and your background and all of those different things. I was writing down questions as we go and so forth, and half of them you answered along the way.
Oh,
Uh,
perfect.
so, so fantastic. Folks, toss into the chat. How many of you are really curious or interested in reading one of her books? Just toss it in there real quick. See a few yeses coming through. So, surprise, surprise. If you stick around and fill out the survey, we will be drawing 31 actually, 31 people. We'll be drawing 31 names, and you have to put in your personal address. We'll be drawing 31 to get a book, and we'll get that out to you in the next coming week. So, Kyla, if you can go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll just start
Okay.
running through some questions. So, I was honestly, you almost seem like you're a kind of a glutton for punishment here because it's you were talking about the imposter syndrome and changing locations in your industry and then taking on writing, and it's you mentioned it at the end about your type A personality. And but do you feel then that, I mean, is that something that you're hoping to do, is tamp down on the amount of change, or what, you love it and it's just part of who you are and you're going to keep going?
Wow, that's a really good question. I've not really considered that before. I think ultimately, like I have quite a few things going on in my life. And it's all about trade-off. Like I've decided that it's worth sacrificing some free time and hang out with friends to do all these different activities. But if I were to one day decide that the trade-off isn't worth it, I will give up whatever I feel is holding me back.
Gotcha. Do you feel like when you're from your own parents, or many of us growing up in these states, at least, a lot of us, had this mental burden of what success needs to be, especially given that our parents had, given up everything to come over here to the States. And I get your background's a little bit different, but maybe there's some similarities. But for many of us, I know that grew up here, we have this either explicitly or implicit notion that we must succeed, and success is absolutely everything you could possibly do, and God forbid you ever like take a day off, type of thing. Do you feel like you had some of that from your parents as well, or is that just you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of my upbringing and also just the culture in Singapore. So for those who don't know, one of the most popular words in Singapore is called kiasu, and that's basically dialect for being scared to lose. And so
Mm.
Singapore is very much as like a red race mentality. And there's always the idea that, something is only worth doing if you could get a tangible reward from it, if you could be recognized with like a medal or certificate or a trophy. And that was my mindset for the longest time. It is still a mindset that I struggle to completely disentangle myself from, just because it has been inculcated in me from such a young age. And so, for instance, that's something that I do explore in my third book, the one about chess, because I grew up playing chess, and at some point my performance anxiety just got so overwhelming because I was so focused on winning medals that the fear of losing overshadowed any joy the game used to bring me. And I think writing was actually one of the very few things in my life that I took up without any expectation of success. When I started writing, it was really an outlet for me. It was almost like therapy. It was my way of dealing with a very difficult, depressing time in my life. And like I said, I didn't think of getting published. And the pandemic was hard for many people in many different ways. It was hard for me, but the silver lining was that for the first time in a long while, I was truly alone. I wasn't living in a dorm surrounded by like all my successful, high-flying peers. And so I didn't have to worry about what other people might think if I were to just try something new. And if I were to fail, even if I failed at writing, like it's okay. No one's going to know I even, started writing a book. And in fact, when I announced my first book deal, like everyone was shocked. They were like, "Since when do you write?" Yeah, but I think that was kind of one of the first times when I tried something with no expectations of success.
Mhm.
And it has changed a little bit because now in a way writing is like a job for me now. Like I have contracts, just things like that. And so I can sometimes feel my mindset sliding back into that old familiar ground of, oh, like how can I measure success, my writing? How can I quantify it in terms of the number of books being sold or the amount of money I get for my books? And so I always have to very consciously tell myself to not fall into that mindset again. It's like a work in progress for me.
Yeah, no, it seems very much like the process of writing on these content while they may not entirely be you in the novel, writing it out has been a bit of a therapy or a way to process your own thoughts and draw some conclusions, whether it's through somebody who looks and feels exactly like you or a different character who is going through similar challenges that you're able to relate to, and somehow that's, congratulations on making that, you know, well, congratulations on the world loving it as
Thank
well,
you.
So Mary Cheers asks, time management, how have you found the time to excel in a full-time job as well as becoming a great author? And how do you manage your time across those two? Any tips that you've learned along the way? I'm here as well. I'm guessing that you weren't perfect on it in day one, and you've figured out some different ways to do that.
Yeah, so on a very micro level, it would be small things like I always write in a cafe. And so I bring my laptop with me, but I never bring my laptop charger. So I know that my laptop's gonna die in like a few hours. And so that forces me to try to be productive in the limited time that I have to write. On the other hand, it also means that as much as possible, I try to have a routine for writing, and for managing my day job. So I know that, from 9 to 6, it will be at my day job. And I try not to do any book activities during that time. This is an exception. But I think it's hard to kind of mentally switch from like my tech job to writing. And so I just try to like compartmentalize them as much as possible. And then I've designated writing time. So that would be, in the evenings or early in the mornings before I start work. Weekend mornings are very precious to me because that's really like my core writing time. And so I got that time very strictly. I pretty much decline all like invitations to hang out. And sometimes that is painful, but like I said earlier, like I feel like the trade-off is worth it for now, and I'm willing to make those sacrifices. One day I might not, but yeah, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it.
Wonderful. I think awareness of that is probably the most important thing of just, and so congratulations on realizing that is something that you will need to think about at some point, because lots of us, we get on a track and we continue year after year, and then before too long, 20, 30 years have passed. We're like, holy cow, what just happened? Where did that go? So, kudos to you for having the awareness on that. Sandeep asks, um, do you feel like writing has enhanced your soft skills in the workplace? And if so, like, you have any examples or any stories around that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, writing doesn't really enhance my tech skills in any
Right.
way. For sure, soft skills. I think, well, would you consider presentation a soft skill? Like,
I think it can be, yeah, it's
yeah,
communication. And
yeah,
so I think that example was a great one
yeah.
that you gave regarding the storytelling. And quite honestly, I'm sorry I'm answering this for you, but quite honestly, that's something that I didn't learn until like 3 years before I left my corporate job. 15, 17 years into my career, I didn't learn exactly what you just said. It's like, it's about the story,
Mhm.
dummy. It's about the story. Forget about putting all your data into the slides. It's about the story. So yeah.
Right. And I think, coming from an outsider background in a way, it was helpful because I wasn't getting lost in the weeds. I wasn't so like overwhelmed by the intricacies of the code that I would just get muddled in it. And like you said, like executives, the final audience, like they don't care about the what, they care about the so what. And
Right.
so in a way, I think writing has been helpful for me in translating the what into the so what. And it's actually been a lot more helpful to me than I realized initially. I think even at the beginning, even when I was like, just starting out, I was entrusted with um, more presentation opportunities because my team realized that like I knew how to package the things into a digestible format for the executives. And one thing I know now that took me some time to learn is that um, working in a corporate job, it's sometimes not even about the work that you do. It's about making sure that the right people gain visibility into your work. And so my job was to help my team achieve that visibility in front of the right audience. And so I think writing and communication has been very helpful for that. And in a way, even when I'm just communicating with like my colleagues, if I need resources or support from another team, if I'm able to explain it in a way where, oh, here is why I need that thing. Here's a story of how it could benefit my team and also your team and also the company as a whole. I think they are willing to be a lot more helpful.
Yeah, no, very, very true. All incredible insights to gain, especially so early in your career. So Jason asks, your parents, were they super supportive of you being so exploratory with your career, not just, I guess fashion to tech, but then also there's a lot of different facets here. And again, under 30, that's that's kind of incredible. So how has your parents' reaction been the entire time?
I think they became more supportive of my writing career when they realized I could make money from it. I think they are relieved when I told them that I don't intend on ever making writing my full-time job. I think I was like, oh, phew, like she's not gonna become like a starving artist. Yeah, so they became supportive after that.
And what's in it for what do you foresee your career path for now? Is tech the place for you? Or are you, well, you know what, maybe you shouldn't answer that, but wherever you feel comfortable answering that because this is public. But like how do you see your own self evolving? And we talked about this a little bit actually in our pre-meetings, on the younger generations feeling more uh willing than older people like me to not just job hop, but even industry hop. So what does like where do you think, what do you foresee for yourself, I suppose, as much
Yeah,
as you're willing to share?
I honestly don't know where I'm gonna end up in like 5 years or even like in 1 year. I think what I do know, almost like 99% sure, is that I don't think I'll ever make writing my full-time job. I think if I did, I would feel if it became my livelihood and my only source of income, I think it would like I would feel a lot more pressure to write what I think will be popular and what I think will sell well. And publishers prefer if an author writes largely the same topic so that you can build up a consistent author brand and a consistent readership. But like I said earlier, my books are kind of all over the place. I like jumping from one topic to the other and experimenting with different things that catch my interest. And I don't think I could quite do that if I'm forced to be more serious about my writing.
Right. No,
So
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
I was
so I
going to
guess
ask you about that as well.
yeah,
How did your publisher react when I presume you pitched, hey, I want to move into young adult and I want
yeah.
to move into something else. How did they react?
Um, well, I think they were a little bit taken aback. I don't think they have met many writers who are so willing to jump around. Um, I think for me, it's because a big part of me still sees writing as a hobby, as something I use to explore parts of myself and to actually learn more about myself. And so, yeah, I don't want to turn it into like a job.
Evan asks, how difficult was it for you to get your work accepted by a literary agent? Like, did you push it out to lots of people and then you went into auction, or like how did you even land on knowing what to do?
Yeah, so the publishing process, at least if you want to be published by one of the big publishing houses in America, like you need a literary agent. The publishers wouldn't even look at your manuscript if you don't have an agent. And to get an agent, it's honestly just cold emailing. You email different literary agencies for your manuscript, hoping that someone will like it enough to want to sign you as a client, and then you work with your agent to once again send your manuscript out to different publishing houses, once again praying that someone will like your book enough to want to buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you even before pushing out publishing a book or even writing a manuscript, were you doing blogs or like short stories or anything on any like literary forums or anything like that that even kind of got you to a novel? Because a novel feels like it's quite a large undertaking.
Yeah, before that, the only writing I've done was for fashion magazines. And I think that is actually writing a book, it's a very different challenge in a way because, firstly, like an article is like 2,000 words. Like my book, it's like 100,000 words. So it's many, many magnitudes larger. And so in a way, writing a book feels a lot more like a marathon rather than a sprint. You have to pace yourself, not just in terms of timing, but also in terms of sustaining your own motivation.
Yeah.
Because when you're writing for a magazine, for instance, you can ask your editor for help. When you're writing a book, it's really just you. And you also have to come up with like your own original ideas, which is scary, but also very, it's like an amazing experience to have something to create like an entire world from your own imagination as well. So yeah, it's different.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question before we close out. So, Tuyet Hanschnell asks, how did you handle comments from agents or publishers that they already have Asian authors and they don't need another?
Yeah, I was lucky that I never experienced those comments. I've heard other writers have them. And, in such case, like, I mean, ideally, you imagine yourself like standing up and speaking up for yourself. But to be frank, there's really just not the environment for that. Like, publishers would just be like, okay, cool, like you're saying weird things, like move away. We have like a million other writers who will happily do what we want. And even besides publishers saying how, they already have enough stories from a certain community, another phenomenon that has become quite apparent, especially after, kind of the Me Too movement, and after that, I would say more of a social awakening during the pandemic, was that publishers care a lot now about trying to represent certain aspects of a community's experience, but sometimes they only want the more painful aspects. Like, for instance, I have a Black writing friend who wanted to write a joyful love story, and the publisher was just like, oh, but what if, you made it sad instead? What if the couple goes through a divorce and then, like, there's a single mom story? And it's like, we don't want to just be writing some sort of trauma porn in a way. We want to write stories that really celebrate the vibrance and the diversity of like our own community.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a very good point. So, hey, Kyla, again, thank you so much for that. Jessica's going to launch a survey. There are 4 questions in here. 3 of them are, on the survey responses, and the 4th one, for those of you who are interested, pop in your personal mailing address, not your work mailing address, because anybody who works for a corporation knows that mail that goes through the mailroom doesn't really show up. So please make sure it's your personal mailing address. So fill this out if you are interested. Well, fill it out regardless. Add your address if you are interested. And our next one is Nanuka Saikia, who runs an organization called Box D. Box D, I think it's pronounced. Become a powerhouse leader who rallies followers and gets even the impossible done. This will be in early November. The registration link, if you go to sasnet.org/webinar, you can register now for that. We are sponsored as of next time by Boeing, so any Boeing people in the house, thank you so much. Please make sure to let your folks in your Asian ERG as well as your DEI office know how much we appreciate it. And more information, you can follow us on the web, you can follow us on LinkedIn. Most importantly, our national convention is coming up, and those of you who recognize the better side of my head realize that that is the back of my head. If it doesn't blind you, we are up in Boston at in the middle of October. We have an amazing program laid out for you. We're about 5 away from hitting 1,000 professionals registered. And so we'll have about 100 executives, tons of students. Our conference features lots of concurrent in-depth workshops with Asian trainers. So 3 keynotes: Jane Hun, who many of you may recognize from Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling. Lan Fan, General Tuguba is also giving a keynote, and then Rajiv Satyal, a comedian, is emceeing the event. We'll start on Wednesday night. Thursday lots and lots of concurrent sessions. This means that no session has more than 100 people. It means that also you can delve into the content to a much greater extent than you would be able to in a normal conference. 2 days of that. And then, these are some of our trainers, fantastic people. Many of these you've seen in prior webinars. One more page of them because we've got 24 of them. And that is all, folks. So thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour. We will see you next time, which is November 6th. But hopefully, we'll see many of you in Boston. And Kyla, thank you again so much. Fantastic
Thank
talk.
you to you and
Love hearing your
Jessica.
experience.
It was
So
so nice to be here. Thanks everyone for joining
thanks,
me.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.